December 20th, 1944. Luxembourg metropolis. The phone line crackled with barely suppressed fury as fashionable Omar Bradley gripped the receiver, his knuckles white against the black bakelite. Throughout the wire came Dwight Eisenhower's measured voice, turning in an order that might test their friendship to its breaking point. Two American armies, the 1st and the 9th, had been being located beneath British command, below Montgomery's command. With the aid of God, I can't be responsible to the Yank people in case you do that, Bradley erupted, his Missouri composure subsequently shattering. I resign. The best commander's response came bloodless and specific. Brad, I now not you am responsible to the American people. Your resignation consequently manner truly nothing. Bradley paused, made one more protest, then fell silent. This second, buried in the chaos of Hitler's Ardennes offensive, crystallized 3 years of mounting American frustration with a British field marshal, who seemed decided to show he by myself ought to win the conflict. Bernard Law, 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, victor of Alamein, hero of Britain, had emerged as the maximum divisive figure in the Allied command shape. However, the query that haunted American headquarters from Tunisia to Germany turned into simpler and extra damning. Why did a coalition fighting for survival in opposition to Nazi tyranny locate itself torn apart now not via the enemy, but by way of the persona of one man? The answer lay no longer in an unmarried incident, but in an accumulation of moments, decisions and clashes that commenced in North African sand and ended in the dust of Northwest Europe. That is the story of the way army genius became military burden, how national pleasure collided with Allied necessity, and how the people got here to view their maximum outstanding British battlefield commander, with feelings starting from exasperation to something coming near loathing. The mathematics of Allied command were deceptively easy but politically complicated. With the aid of overdue 1944, American forces in Europe outnumbered British troops via vast margins. American commercial output dwarfed Britain's war-stretched economy. Yet, Field Marshal Bernard Law appeared constitutionally incapable of acknowledging these realities or adjusting his conduct consequently. To American eyes, Bernard Law Montgomery represented the whole thing that they had fought a revolution to break out: aristocratic presumption, colonial condescension, and an unshakable belief in British superiority. However, Montgomery became no cool animated film. He was definitely outstanding, meticulous in training, careful with his soldiers' lives in methods that endeared him to his troops. His victories have been actual, his tactical acumen plain. British soldiers battered with the aid of early battle defeats had located in Montgomery a commander who received battles even as preserving casualty lists manageable. Churchill cherished him. The British public cherished him. None of this mattered to American commanders who located themselves again and again sidelined, patronized, and publicly dwindled by way of a field marshal who appeared to view them as enthusiastic amateurs requiring British steering. The friction began no longer with grand strategic disputes, however with something a ways more non-public appreciate, or the lack thereof. From their first encounters in North Africa through the final victory in Germany, American commanders would find out that 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's treatment of them revealed assumptions about American competence, American braveness, and American worth that cut deeper than any battlefield war of words. March 6, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desolate tracked wind carried the acrid smell of burned cars and defeat across the Tunisian panorama as Lieutenant General George S. Patton stepped off his plane, arriving to expect command of the battered 2nd Corps. 20 days earlier, German forces below Field Marshal Erwin R.M.L. had savaged American gadgets of their first primary engagement with veteran Wehrmacht troops. The defeat had been complete, humiliating, and instructive. What greeted Patton became now not simply a demoralized command, but a British command shape that considered American forces as unreliable auxiliaries requiring careful supervision. Preferred Sir Harold Alexander, the brand-new British commander of 18th Navy Group overseeing all Allied floor forces in Tunisia, had drafted a file on American combat performance that studied like an indictment. American commanders lacked in joy. American troops lacked discipline. American devices required enormous British oversight before they might be trusted with big obligations. The file became not completely unfair. Kasserine Skip had exposed genuine deficiencies in American leadership, procedures, and mixed fingers coordination. But Alexander's reaction went beyond corrective grievance. In his view, Second Corps need to be assigned helping roles while British forces achieve the number one attacks. Patton understood at once what changed into at stake. This became no longer merely approximately defeating RML. It turned into approximately proving that American arms should stand along their British counterparts as equals. His diary entries from this period documented British presumption and his determination to prove American really worth through competitive motion. Bernard L. Montgomery, commanding the British 8th Navy drawing close Tunisia from the east, embodied the British assumptions Patton resented. The victor of Alamein carried himself with the confidence of a commander who had reversed Britain's fortunes within the desert. He had pushed RML across North Africa through methodical, cautiously prepared operations that emphasized overwhelming fabric superiority rather than tactical flair. His infantrymen depended on him because he received without losing their lives unnecessarily. But his manner advised that he alone understood contemporary war, and that others, mainly Americans, had a good deal to study. Alexander's operational plan for the very last Tunisia campaign reflected those assumptions. Bernard L. Montgomery's 8th Navy would deliver the primary blow in opposition to the Marath Line, the Axis fortifications in southern Tunisia. Patton's Second Corps might conduct helping assaults, drawing German interest far away from 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's essential effort. The Americans would function Bernard L. Montgomery's protect, whilst the British gained the honor of breaking through to Tunis. The plan had Navy good judgment. Bernard L. Montgomery commanded veteran troops with confirmed success in opposition to German armor. Patton led formations nevertheless studying their trade, but the allocation of missions carried implications beyond tactical prudence. It hooked up expectations that could hang out American commanders all through the warfare. British forces taking the lead, American forces presenting assist, British commanders receiving credit, at the same time as American achievements went overlooked or minimized. Patton released his offensive in the direction of El Guettar on March 17, 1943. Decided to show American competence via competitive movement, his orders contemplated his character, blending tactical steerage with needs for competitive leadership. Officers could lead from the front. American troops might display the same competitive spirit that had characterized their access into the primary world struggle. Regardless of the cost, the two corps might show that it deserved to be dealt with as a combat force instead of profession troops. The Battle of Eluder provided vindication. On March 23, 50 German tanks of the 10th Panzer Division emerged from mountain passes into the valley, executing a sunrise assault designed to shatter American defenses. What followed bowled over the German commanders. American artillery, placed with careful interest to overlapping fields of fire, unleashed devastating concentrations on the advancing armor. Tank destroyers located to take advantage of terrain blessings engaged the panzers at tiers that negated German tactical superiority. Via day's end, the battlefield turned into suffering from destroyed German automobiles, and the 10th Panzer Division had been stopped bloodless. For the first time, American forces had defeated skilled German armored devices in sustained combat. However, the victory carried a bitter aftertaste. Alexander's headquarters, focused on Bernard L. Montgomery's operations towards the Marath Line, paid minimal interest to 2D middle achievement. British workforce officials persevered to difficulty-precise commands to Patton, micromanaging American operations in ways that recommended continual doubts approximately American competence. Extra glowing nonetheless, Alexander again and again changed second cause objectives, shifting priorities in methods that appeared designed to make certain American forces remained auxiliary to British operations. Patton could be ordered to advance, then halt, assault with armor, then lead with infantry. Every alternate disrupted American operations and signaled that 2D middle existed usually to facilitate Bernard Law Montgomery's plans instead of to attain impartial goals. When Sir Bernard Law finally attacked the Marath line on March 20th, his preliminary assault made little progress towards decided German resistance. He adapted with the aid of shifting his foremost effort to an outflanking maneuver, demonstrating the ability that characterized his pleasant operations. But the amendment required time, permitting German forces to set up new shielding positions. By the time 8th military broke through, the possibility for a decisive pursuit had passed. Second Corps continued its supporting attacks in valuable Tunisia, drawing German reserves away from Bernard Law Montgomery's the front. American forces superior gradually, taking targets and inflicting casualties on Axis forces. But these achievements went largely unacknowledged in British reporting. First Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's breakthrough received vast publicity. Patton's contribution, equally essential to the general marketing campaign, merited minimal mention. Whilst the victory parade turned into held in Tunis on May 20th, 1943, with standard Eisenhower Alexander and French well-known Henry Giraud taking the salute. The narrative emphasized British and French achievements at the same time as American contributions received cursory acknowledgement. For American commanders, Tunisia furnished lessons that went past approaches and logistics. They discovered that fighting alongside the British meant fighting for recognition as well as victory. They located that Bernard Law Montgomery, anything his Navy competencies, seemed incapable of treating American forces as authentic partners in preference to promising apprentices. And they started out to suspect that this mindset pondered now not just first Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's character, however a broader British unwillingness to simply accept that the balance of power inside the alliance had shifted irrevocably towards Washington. These training would prove prophetic when the Allies turned their attention to the subsequent objective. Sicily, July 10, 1943, Gulf of Jala, Sicily. The biggest amphibious assault in records to that point rolled in the direction of the shores of Sicily as Operation Husky. The invasion of Italy's largest island started out in darkness and heavy seas. Over 8 divisions divided among General Bernard First Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's British 8th Military, and Standard George Patton's American 7th Navy stormed seashores from Cape Scaramia to Syracuse, in an operation that would take a look at Allied team spirit as thoroughly as it examined German and Italian defenses. The plan for Operation Husky were contentious from its inception. Initial proposals envisioned landings dispersed throughout Sicily, seizing Port Speedy to make certain good enough deliver for next operations. First Viscount Montgomery of Alamein detested dispersed landings. His enjoy in North Africa had satisfied him that awareness of pressure became paramount, that scattering troops invited defeat in element. On April 24, 1943, he articulated his objections and proposed an opportunity. Listen, all landings on Sicily's southeastern corner, giving 8th Army the clean undertaking of using immediately to Messina, the island's northeastern port and the gateway to mainland Italy. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Admiral Andrew Cunningham, liable for air and naval operations, respectively, opposed Montgomery's plan. It'd leave 13 Axis airfields operational, posing unacceptable risks to the invasion fleet. It'd require ships to stay concentrated in restrained waters, vulnerable to air attack. Their objections carried weight. Each men commanded appreciate earned via successful operations. Bernard Law Montgomery's response discovered the overall force of his personality. He threatened, with Churchill's backing, to resign as opposed to execute a plan he'd taken into consideration fundamentally mistaken. Faced with a disaster that threatened to derail the whole invasion, Eisenhower referred to as a convention for May 2D to remedy the dispute. The assembly uncovered fault strains that would widen for the duration of the struggle. First, Viscount Montgomery of Alamein provided his case with self-belief bordering on vanity. Ted and Cunningham pushed again, protecting the significance of airfields and naval safety. Eisenhower attempting to stability army necessities, in opposition to coalition politics in the end, sided with Bernard L. Montgomery. The landings might be focused in southeastern Sicily, with 8th Navy driving toward Messina and 7th Navy protecting 8th Army's left flank. For Patton analyzing the final plan in North Africa while making ready his command for invasion, the results were unmistakable. 7th Navy would play a assisting role. Sir Bernard Law would lead the main assault. The British would take Messina while Americans guarded their flank. All over again, American forces were relegated to secondary missions at the same time as British commanders pursued glory. The choice rankled for reasons beyond Patton's good-sized ego. Via July 1943, American forces within the Mediterranean theater had grown considerably. 7th Military comprised 3 infantry divisions, an armored department, and sizable assist troops, a pressure similar in length to 8th Navy. American business output became flooding Allied stockpiles with device. American air electricity ruled Mediterranean skies, yet the command shape handled American forces as auxiliaries to be hired at British discretion. Patton's diary entry from July 12 captured his frustration with brutal readability. Alexander and his totally British body of workers had visited 7th Navy headquarters to offer the operational plan, a plan that, during Patton's view, cut Americans off from any opportunity of taking Messina. He referred to bitterly that Alexander, commanding British and American armies, arrived without American officers on his team of workers. "What fools we're," Patton wrote, recognizing that American political leaders had typical a command arrangement that guaranteed American marginalization. The landings themselves went moderately well in spite of chaotic airborne operations that noticed British and American paratroopers scattered throughout the nation-state, many drowning whilst their gliders crashed into the Mediterranean. By using sunrise on July 10th, each armies had secured their seaside heads and were pushing inland. Initial resistance from Italian coastal divisions crumbled quick. German counterattacks towards Gela Beach, where Patton's forces landed, have been defeated with the help of naval gunfire and decided combating by using the primary infantry division. Bernard Law Montgomery, assured that Axis resistance might collapse earlier than methodical British pressure, signaled Alexander that the course to Messina lay open. His 8th Army might power immediately up the Japanese coast. Patton's 7th Army must keep defensively, protective 8th Military's flank whilst Bernard Law Montgomery pursued what he assumed could be a demoralized enemy. The sign revealed 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's assumptions. British forces would supply the knockout blow. American forces would offer protection. Reality intruded rapidly. German forces, far from collapsing, mounted sturdy protecting positions, exploiting Sicily's mountainous terrain. 8th Military's improve slowed down south of Catania, wherein German paratroopers held positions that channelized British attacks into killing zones. Sir Bernard Law's methodical approach, so powerful inside the wasteland, struggled in opposition to defenders who could listen forces on slender fronts and combat from organized positions. On July 12th, as 8th Navy's improve stalled, 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein sent a signal to Alexander that could outline Anglo-American members of the family for the rest of the warfare. He proposed that 8th Military expand its operational place westward, correctly commandeering a key street assigned to 7th Military. The accelerated frontage might allow him to outflank German positions, blocking his boost. American forces need to, he advised, halt and shield while 8th Army accomplished the offensive that might reduce Sicily in half of. The signal's tone turned into as vast as its content. Sir Bernard Law did now not request Alexander's approval. He knowledgeable Alexander of his intentions and cautioned that American forces alter for that reason. The presumption changed into impressive. Montgomery became featuring to appropriate American operational regions, relegate American forces to static defense, and execute an approach that ensured British forces on my own could advantage credit score for Sicily's conquest. Alexander, whose admiration for Sir Bernard Law outweighed his self-belief in American commanders, agreed. On July 13th, he issued an order assigning Montgomery the disputed street and educating Patton to maintain defensively while 8th Army advanced. For the Yank commanders analyzing the order, the message became unmistakable. British choices might determine Allied approach irrespective of American contributions or skills. Patton's preliminary reaction confirmed the political constraints that annoyed American commanders for the duration of the warfare. In spite of his fury expressed in diary entries comparing 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein to an boastful prima donna, and Alexander to an incompetent sycophant, Patton formerly well known the order without protest. He understood that Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in the Mediterranean, could not have the funds for open revolt by subordinate commanders. Coalition struggle required compromise and accommodation, even when compromise meant swallowing justified anger. But Patton had no aim of allowing 7th Navy to take a seat idle whilst Montgomery pursued victory. If Alexander could now not assign Americans a #1 undertaking, Patton could create one. He flew to Alexander's headquarters on July 17th, carrying a map and a suggestion. As opposed to defend passively, 7th Army would power northwest towards Como, Sicily's capital and fundamental port. The operation would cut the island in 1-2, entice Italian forces in western Sicily, and relaxed port facilities that could ease American deliver problems. Alexander, possibly amazed by way of Patton's initiative or definitely relieved to peer American aggression directed far from Montgomery's operations, authorized. The choice essentially altered the Sicily campaign. Rather than a single British enhance up the east coast, supported through American defensive operations, the Allies might now behavior separate drives. Bernard Law Montgomery could maintain pushing closer to Messina from the south and east. Patton would race to Palmo, then flip east and power towards Messina alongside Sicily's northern coast. What began as a strategic adjustment swiftly became a private opposition. Patton decided to prove American skills and reach Messina earlier than Bernard Law Montgomery, drove his command with function intensity. 7th Military moved with a pace that greatly surprised both allies and enemies, protecting rugged terrain at quotes Bernard Law Montgomery's methodical technique should in no way healthy. Simply 12 days after touchdown, American troops entered Palmo on July 22nd, shooting Sicily's largest metropolis and a main port, Montgomery. In the meantime, continued grinding in opposition to German defenses south of Mount Etna. His development turned into measured, professional, and more irrelevant to the marketing campaign's outcome. German forces, recognizing that Sicily couldn't be held, had started preparing for evacuation to mainland Italy. The question turned into not whether or not the Allies could overcome Sicily, however which Allied military might reach Messina first and claim the symbolic victory. The race to Messina discovered person as a lot as functionality. Patton pushed 7th Navy to the limits of staying power, annoying relentless strengthen regardless of boundaries or casualties. His corps commanders, aware of his fashion, drove their divisions difficult. American engineers repaired roads and bridges with first-rate pace. American infantry marched through heat and mountainous terrain at paces that left assist gadgets suffering to hold pace. Bernard Law Montgomery's 8th Navy, facing stronger competition on extra-tough terrain, advanced methodically. British commanders, trained to decrease casualties and husband resources, refused to hazard failures in pursuit of pace. The comparison illustrated essential variations in American and British military cultures. Americans with enormous manpower reserves and commercial capacity ought to have enough money, tactical dangers, and heavy casualties. British combating for the reason that 1939 with dwindling manpower and exhausted economy could not. However, the race become also personal. Sir Bernard Law's public statements and private correspondence revealed that he considered 8th Military's challenge greater essential and greater tough than 7th Navy's operations. American achievement in achieving Palermo from Bernard Law Montgomery's angle-tested nothing giant. Patton had confronted weak Italian competition in secondary terrain. 8th Army confronted veteran German troops in positions that favored protection. The comparison, Sir Bernard Law implied, was meaningless. American commanders saw Sir Bernard Law's dismissal of their achievements as feature British condescension, that they had heard comparable exams in Tunisia. American successes have been minimized. American difficulties explained with the aid of inexperience. American commanders patronized as enthusiastic but untutored. This attitude counseled that British appreciate for American arms was in simple terms conditional, prolonged simplest whilst American forces operated below British command steering and for British goals. On August 17, 1943, elements of Patton's 0.33 Infantry Department entered Messina numerous hours before British forces arrived. 7th Navy had gained the race. However, the victory became whole in ways that contemplated the poisonous nation of Allied command relationships. Bernard Law Montgomery's public reaction blended graciousness with subtle dismissal. He congratulated Patton while emphasizing the problems 8th Military had faced and implying that terrain as opposed to competence explained outcomes. British press insurance meditated Sir Bernard Law's framing. Reviews celebrated 8th Army's preventing against the Germans at the same time as treating 7th Military advance as a city show in opposition to inferior opposition. American achievements have been mentioned but dwindled, presented as complementary to, in preference to same with British operations. For American commanders reading these debts, the message became clear. British narratives could continually middle British achievements regardless of objective evidence. The Sicily campaign left scars that could by no means completely heal. American commanders had confirmed that their forces could healthy British troops in operational pace and combat effectiveness. However, popularity from their British opposite numbers remained grudging and conditional. Sir Bernard Law specifically appeared constitutionally not able to well known that American commanders would possibly possess abilities comparable to his very own, or that American forces might deserve credit commensurate with their contributions. 2 incidents in the course of the Sicily marketing campaign further poisoned relationships. On August 3rd and again on August 10th, Patton slapped hospitalized squaddies he accused of cowardice, triggering a scandal that would hang out his career. When phrase reached 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, his response turned into coldly dismissive. Patton's behavior showed British assumptions approximately American in field and emotionalism. A British commander, 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein advised, could never lose control in such fashion. The second incident involved a young British Lieutenant Montgomery dispatched to Patton's headquarters as liaison officer. The lieutenant arrived with a suitcase tied with string, a shabby appearance that enraged Patton. In advance, Patton had dispatched Bernard Law Montgomery a full liaison group, inclusive of a colonel, a major, and a whole communications segment. In alternate, Montgomery had dispatched an unmarried junior officer with inadequate equipment. Patton dispatched the lieutenant lower back with a word explaining that he couldn't permit boys in his headquarters. The incident became minor, almost comical, but it captured the casual disrespect that characterized Sir Bernard Law's remedy of American opposite numbers. Patton commanded in military same in size to Bernard Law Montgomery's 8th Military. He deserved, by any general of expert courtesy, liaison officers of appropriate rank and competence. Bernard Law Montgomery's failure to offer them cautioned that he considered 7th Navy as subordinate irrespective of reliable command relationships. As Allied planners grew to become their attention to the invasion of Italy, ultimately to Operation Overlord, the past Channel invasion of France, one reality had turned out to be indisputable. Bernard Law Montgomery considered himself as the preeminent Allied battlefield commander and predicted deference from American subordinates. Consequently, that American commanders increasingly regarded Montgomery because the number one obstacle to real Anglo-American partnership seemed no longer to register with the British Field Marshal, or possibly it surely did no longer depend. September 1st, 1944, northern France. The Allied breakout from Normandy had shattered German defenses in France, sending Wehrmacht forces reeling eastward in headlong retreat. Paris were liberated on August 25, 1944, amid jubilant scenes that seemed to verify the struggle's imminent quit. From Normandy beaches to Belgium, Allied armies pursued defeated enemies throughout terrain in which, just months in advance, German forces had regarded unbeatable. Victory, perhaps with the aid of Christmas, regarded inside hold close. For Field Marshal Bernard, 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, lately promoted and basking in the glory of Normandy's success, the instant demanded formidable movement. He had commanded all Allied ground forces in the course of the Normandy invasion, a duty that blended with his earlier victories in North Africa, and Sicily confirmed his repute as Britain's finest battlefield commander. Now with German armies in disarray, Sir Bernard Law noticed impossibility to cease the battle with a single decisive thrust. However, September 1st additionally added a trade that Sir Bernard Law resented with slightly concealed fury. General Dwight Eisenhower, the best Allied commander, assumed private command of all Allied ground forces. Sir Bernard Law, who had exercised operational manage of both American and British armies during Normandy, turned into now decreased to commanding 21st Military Group, the British and Canadian forces preventing in Northwest Europe. His American counterpart, fashionable Omar Bradley, commanded the 12th Army institution comprising the Yankee 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies. The trade turned into inevitable. American forces in Europe now outnumbered British and Canadian troops notably. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air energy ruled EU skis. American business capacity furnished the cloth foundation for Allied victory. Political fact demanded American command of a coalition that had ended up overwhelmingly American in composition. Sir Bernard Law understood the politics, but conventional neither the necessity nor the implications. In his view, dispersing command authority amongst multiple headquarters diluted the decisive management that victory required. Eisenhower, whatever his political talents, lacked the battlefield and joy to direct ground operations correctly. The ideally suited commander's position, Montgomery argued with increasing stridency, should be restrained to political and logistical coordination. Operational command need to stay concentrated inside the hands of a single ground forces commander, a person with Bernard Law Montgomery's tested battlefield credentials. The notion had one apparent beneficiary, Sir Bernard Law himself. However, the area marshal provided his case as military necessity as opposed to non-public ambition. Eisenhower's deliberate approach, advancing into Germany on an extensive front with a couple of armies attacking simultaneously, was, Montgomery insisted, strategically unsound. It dispersed assets, averted decisive awareness, and assured that the battle could drag into 1945. 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's opportunity become generally formidable and in general self-centered. As opposed to an extensive the front enhance, the Allies need to listen forces for a single powerful thrust into northern Germany. This thrust would pass the Rhine, capture the Ruhr industrial location, and drive to Berlin earlier than German forces should establish coherent defenses. Sir Bernard Law could obviously command this decisive operation with American forces supplying guide and defensive flanks. The concept's army merits had been debatable. A slim thrust deep into Germany could create an elongated salient prone to counterattack. It would require leaving behind operations some other place, allowing German forces to pay attention towards the advance. It trusted capturing bridges intact and preserving supply lines over hundreds of miles of contested territory. Maximum essentially, it assumed that German resistance had collapsed to the factor where a rapid improve might face minimal competition. However, the suggestion's political implications were unmistakable. Bernard Law Montgomery changed into asking American political leaders to subordinate their armies to British command for an operation that could ensure British forces below British leadership, added the decisive blow finishing the warfare. He turned into asking for that American troops function Bernard Law Montgomery's protect, whilst the British discipline marshal carried out very last victory. And he was worrying in impact that Eisenhower give up operational manage to a subordinate who made no mystery of his contempt for the very best commander's strategic judgment. Eisenhower, attempting to balance Navy requirements against coalition politics, compromised. He might not listen all forces for Montgomery's northern thrust. However, he could provide Montgomery precedents for resources and authorize a confined operation to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. Operation Market Lawn, because the plan became detailed, would employ 3 airborne divisions to seize bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British ground forces could then boost unexpectedly throughout the captured bridges, establish a bridgehead over the Rhine, and roll themselves for subsequent operations into Germany. For American commanders, especially Bradley and Patton, Bernard Law Montgomery's brand new scheme confirmed their worst suspicions. The Field Marshal was all over again attempting to relegate American forces to supporting roles while British troops pursued glory. He became disturbing supplies that might in any other case sustain American advances in vital France. And he became featuring an operation whose dangers regarded wildly disproportionate to capacity gains. Patton, commanding 1-3 Navy using in the direction of Germany through eastern France, exploded when he learned that fuel allocations were being shifted to Sir Bernard Law. His army had established throughout August that aggressive American operations could strengthen quicker, and in addition than careful British moves. 0.33 Navy was drawing close the German border and the Rye River. But Eisenhower was halting American operations to resource a British field marshal whose track documents suggested methodical warning instead of operational boldness. Bradley, normally greater diplomatic than Patton, shared his subordinates' frustration. Montgomery asked sources, threatened dire outcomes if denied, and obtained precedence regardless of American desires or achievements. The politics of coalition conflict, Bradley recognized, assured that British needs would acquire sympathetic hearings whilst American forces supplied the bulk of Allied fight electricity. September 17, 1944, the Netherlands. Operation Marketplace Garden started out with the biggest airborne operation in records. Over 35,000 American and British paratroopers dropped from delivery plane and glided into Dutch fields, tasked with seizing bridges earlier than German forces may want to spoil them. British ground forces led by means of XXX Middle commenced advancing north alongside an unmarried toll road, racing to relieve airborne units before German counterattacks overwhelmed them. The operation failed comprehensively. Intelligence had detected German armor gadgets close to Arnhem, the northernmost objective. However, these warnings were dismissed. Airborne forces landed too far from their targets, allowing Germans to prepare defense. The unmarried toll road have become a demise lure with British armor not able to strengthen speedy or maneuver off roads bordered through marshland. German resistance, far from collapsing, intensified as Wehrmacht commanders diagnosed the threat and rushed reinforcements to the conflict. At Arnhem Bridge, British paratroopers beneath Lieutenant Colonel John Frost held one stop towards overwhelming odds for days, awaiting relief that never got here. XX Corps, stalled by using German counterattacks and not able to pass destroyed bridges, in no way reached Arnhem. Through September 25th, while the operation changed into abandoned, over 17,000 Allied troops have been killed, wounded, or captured. The Butcher Bill blanketed kind of 400 paratroopers who had landed at Arnhem, most now dead or prisoners. The failure became total. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defenses inside the Netherlands solidified. Allied momentum, which in early September had seemed unstoppable, dissipated in Dutch fields and alongside a toll road the British would later name Hell's Motorway, and the possibility to give up the warfare in 1944 evaporated in what would show to be Montgomery's most catastrophic mistake. American reactions combined vindication with anger. Patton and Bradley had hostile marketplace lawn, arguing that its risks outweighed potential advantages. They had recommended that sources allotted to Montgomery's scheme could be hired continuing American advances toward Germany. Their objections had been dismissed, overruled by means of political requirements, and Sir Bernard Law's insistent fact. Now, with Marketplace Garden's failure undeniable, American commanders felt entitled to a few pride that activities had confirmed their judgment. However, delight became crushed by fury at Sir Bernard Law's response to the catastrophe. Instead of accepting responsibility for an operation he had conceived, planned, and commanded, Sir Bernard Law characterized Market Garden as 90% a success. The bridges at Eindhoven and Nîmes have been captured. Allied forces had liberated extensive Dutch territory. That Arnhem, the operation's primary goal, had no longer been secured. Become presented as a minor setback in an in any other case positive marketing campaign. The claim become breathtaking in its dishonesty. Market Gardens' reason turned into to set up a bridgehead over the Rhine. This had now not been done. The operation had over 17,000 casualties for no strategic advantage, but Sir Bernard Law was maintaining victory, rewriting failure as fulfillment through sheer force of character. American commanders recognized the maneuver for what it was. Montgomery protected his recognition on the cost of fact. When Sir Bernard Law succeeded, credit score became his on my own. Whilst operations faltered, reasons worried inadequate sources, insufficient support, or others' failures. Non-public obligation for setbacks became conspicuously absent from Sir Bernard Law's narrative. However, Montgomery's most egregious offense becomes still to come back. In the aftermath of Market Lawn, as Allied operations transitioned to grinding advances against reinforced German defenses, First Viscount Montgomery of Alamein started out publicly criticizing Eisenhower's approach. The broad front approach, he argued in comments to British press and in indicators to Churchill, had squandered the possibility for decisive victory. Had his plan been followed, had he acquired the assets and authority he requested, the warfare might be over. The critique ignored inconvenient realities. Montgomery had acquired substantial resources for Market Lawn. The operation's failure resulted from unsuitable making plans, intelligence errors, and underestimating German capabilities in preference to from inadequate assist. But First Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's narrative transformed operational incompetence right into an overlooked possibility supposedly due to others' strategic brief-sightedness. For American commanders, Bernard Law Montgomery's deflection showed that the sector marshal could in no way renown personal mistakes. Every setback had become a person else's failure. Every fulfillment turned into his triumph. This sample counseled not simply conceitedness, however something greater corrosive, an essential disability for sincere self-assessment that made Bernard Law Montgomery dangerous to Allied cohesion, even as his tactical abilities remained treasured. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. At sunrise, German forces released their closing high-quality offensive in the west, attacking through the Ardennes in a desperate gamble to split Allied armies and seize the port of Antwerp. The attack done whole marvel, smashing into thinly held American positions and creating a bulge in Allied lines that would deliver the war its call. For 10 days, the outcome hung in balance as German spearheads drove towards the Meuse River, threatening to fracture Allied defenses and prolong the struggle indefinitely. The warfare of the Bulge became Montgomery's best and worst moment simultaneously. His military performance was exemplary. While Eisenhower transferred command of American 1st and 9th Armies to 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein on December 20th, the sector marshal right away imposed order on careworn defensive operations. He positioned British reserves to defend the Foundation crossings. He coordinated American counterattacks. He established beneath proper crisis conditions why Britain valued his management. But Bernard Law Montgomery's conduct after the war sowed bitterness that would persist a long time after the battle. On January 7, 1945, with German forces in full retreat and Allied victory confident, Montgomery held a press convention ostensibly to praise American troops and protect Eisenhower. What emerged alternatively changed into a masterclass in self-advertising disguised as gracious compliment. Bernard Law Montgomery started via praising the Yankee soldiers' fighting traits, but he fast pivoted to describing his very own moves upon taking command. Movements offered as decisive interventions that stored American forces from catastrophe. As soon as I noticed what became going on, 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein defined, I took positive steps myself to ensure that if the Germans were given to the Meuse, they could definitely not recover from that river. He persisted, describing how he had tidied up the battlefield, how he had idea beforehand, how he had ensured balanced dispositions. The battle, Bernard Law Montgomery concluded, had been most thrilling, possibly one of the most thrilling and intricate battles he had ever handled. In the course of the recitation, British actions have been highlighted, Bernard Law Montgomery's brilliance emphasized, and American commanders conspicuously absent from the narrative. The performance turned into calculated insult disguised as compliment. 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein praised American squaddies while implying they have been saved through his superior management. He credited American braveness at the same time, as suggesting that American commanders had been overwhelmed by means of occasions until British professionalism imposed order. And he characterized a desperate shielding war won mostly by means of American units just like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and by using Patton's fast counterattack from the south as a Bernard Law Montgomery triumph. American reaction changed into explosive. Bradley, reading press reports of the conference, felt profound betrayal. 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein had commanded 2 American armies for slightly 3 weeks. The one's armies had fought magnificently, maintaining towards overwhelming odds till German offensive momentum exhausted itself. Patton's 0.33 Army had executed a super counterattack, pivoting 90 degrees in iciness conditions to relieve Bastogne. American infantrymen had paid in blood to defeat Hitler's final gamble. Yet Bernard Law Montgomery's narrative minimized American contributions and elevated his personal role to valuable importance. This became no longer merely conceitedness. It changed into historic theft and tried to rewrite American victory as British rescue. And it changed into American commanders recognized Bernard Law Montgomery's true view of events. He clearly believed that his intervention had stored American forces. He saw not anything irrelevant in claiming credit for a warfare received overwhelmingly via troops he had commanded for less than a month. The press conference caused something near command disaster. Bradley called Eisenhower furious past diplomatic constraint. He could not, he declared, serve underneath Sir Bernard Law. If Eisenhower intended to give the British area marshal permanent command of American forces, Bradley might surrender. The ultimatum became now not idle hazard. Bradley, commonly the maximum diplomatically skilled of American commanders, had reached his breaking factor. Eisenhower, recognizing that Allied team spirit hung with the aid of a thread, tried to calm Bradley while privately drafting a message to the combined chiefs of body of workers. In it, he stated plainly that he would request Sir Bernard Law's relief until the sector marshal apologized and ceased his public criticisms. The conflict had been gained, Eisenhower implied. However, whether or not the alliance survived victory remained uncertain. The crisis was resolved simplest after severe British pressure forced Bernard Law Montgomery to apprehend his error. On January 12th, 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein wrote to Eisenhower expressing regret and acknowledging that his press conference had precipitated offense. To Bradley, he dispatched a conciliatory letter praising American troops and expressing gratitude for the respect of commanding them temporarily. The letters had been gracious, reputedly sincere, and largely irrelevant. The damage turned into completed. American commanders now understood with absolute clarity that Sir Bernard Law might by no means view them as proper partners. Each operation could be filtered through 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's assessment of the way it affected his popularity. Every failure would be explained through inadequate assist or others' mistakes. Each achievement could be claimed as validation of Montgomery's knowledge. This sample became fixed, predictable, and insupportable, but more than personality clashes were at stake. By early 1945, the balance of forces in Europe had shifted so decisively toward American predominance that Bernard Law Montgomery's pretensions to battlefield supremacy had emerged as not merely hectic, however operationally counterproductive. American armies comprised over 60 divisions. British and Canadian forces numbered fewer than 20. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air energy ruled EU skies. Yet Montgomery persevered, behaving as even though British wisdom should manual American power. The contradiction contemplated broader tensions in Anglo-American relations. Britain, exhausted by 5 years of battle and dealing with post-war monetary crumble, struggled to accept that its international predominance had ended. America, rising as the sector's dominant energy, became discovering that Navy might created political responsibilities that American traditions had not prepared it to count on. 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's lack of ability to adjust to these realities made him a symbol of England's trouble accepting dwindled fame. Winston Churchill, looking 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's press convention disaster unfold, identified the chance. He spoke in Parliament on January 18th, carefully calibrating his phrases to restore Allied relationships. The Battle of the Bulge, Churchill said, really was predominantly an American warfare, an American victory, and would be remembered as an ever well-known American triumph. British forces had performed a supporting role, as coalition companions must. The speech was diplomatic necessity, correcting Sir Bernard Law's narrative and acknowledging Navy realities. However, it also represented Britain's popularity that the warfare's final campaigns would be generally American endeavors. British forces might participate, make contributions, and percentage victory. However, American commanders would increasingly dictate strategy, direct operations, and claim the credit score that their forces' predominance merited. Bernard Law Montgomery, remoted by way of his very own conduct and increasingly irrelevant to operations ruled via American armies, spent the warfare's very last months commanding 21st Navy Institution in Northern Europe. His operations had been professional. His tactical feel remained sound, but his dating with American commanders never recovered. Bradley averted him. Patton despised him. Eisenhower tolerated him as political necessity demanded, but by no means again trusted his judgment or his motives. Can also 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The ECU war changed into over. Victory belonged to an Allied coalition that had conquered not simply Nazi Germany, but additionally internal divisions that had repeatedly threatened to tear it apart. Within the euphoria of peace, vintage conflicts have been briefly submerged. Bernard Law Montgomery acquired accolades from grateful British public. American commanders again domestic to celebrations that diagnosed their achievements. But in memoirs and histories written after the battle, the conflicts resurfaced. Montgomery's posted memories acting in 1958 reignited vintage controversies via criticizing Eisenhower and implicitly claiming that Montgomery's strategic imaginative and prescient have been advanced. Eisenhower, then President of the United States, broke off personal contact, refusing to correspond with a former colleague who regarded determined to refight battles from a vanished struggle. Bradley's memoir, posted in 1951, meticulously documented instances where Bernard Law Montgomery's behavior had undermined Allied operations. Patton's posthumously posted diary discovered the intensity of his contempt for the British Field Marshal. American histories of the struggle, drawing on those accounts and reliable records, offered Sir Bernard Law as talented, however difficult, high quality but unbearable, a commander whose contributions were actual, but whose character made him a liability to coalition war. British historians defended Montgomery, arguing that American commanders in no way appreciated his methodical approach, his challenge for casualties, his strategic sophistication. They referred to that Sir Bernard Law never lost a chief conflict after assuming command in North Africa. They emphasized that his making plans and training had made D-Day successful. They advised that American criticisms pondered jealousy of British professionalism and resentment of British Army traditions. The debate endured for decades after the participants' deaths. Historians argued about 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's proper contributions, approximately whether American frustrations have been justified, approximately how personalities affected Navy operations. A few concluded that Montgomery changed into a first-rate commander poorly suited to coalition conflict. Others cautioned that American commanders, missing Montgomery's revel in, resented his superior judgment. Nevertheless, others argued that the conflicts pondered inevitable tensions, while proud nations tried to cooperate in existential struggle. However, beneath historiographical debates lay a simpler reality, one which American commanders of the Second World Struggle understood with crystalline readability. Bernard 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, for all his capabilities, couldn't treat American forces as equals. Whether or not this disability reflected non-public vanity, cultural prejudice, or British dedication to keep fatting supremacy remained controversial. What was indisputable became that Montgomery's behavior poisoned Allied relationships and created unnecessary limitations to coalition struggle. The Yank experience with Sir Bernard Law supplied instructions that outlived the war. Destiny coalition operations would be established to save U-character conflicts from undermining Army effectiveness. Command preparations could be designed to make sure proportional representation and prevent any state from dominating simply via advanced self-belief or ancient precedent. And American Navy tradition might internalize weariness of allies who confused partnership with subordination. For the individuals who fought alongside 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein from Tunisia to Germany, the Field Marshal represented what they believed that they had left behind in 1776. The assumption that British knowledge must manual American electricity, that colonial enthusiasm required metropolitan sophistication to be successful, that new global power needed old-world experience to keep away from disaster. They determined that battlefield excellence, commercial might, and Navy achievement could not overcome cultural assumptions rooted in centuries of British worldwide dominance. Sir Bernard Law never understood this. To his death in 1976, he maintained that his wartime behavior had been appropriate, his criticisms justified, his strategic imaginative and prescient advanced to alternatives. He remained satisfied that Eisenhower's management had been inadequate, that American commanders had lacked his expert competence, that the warfare ought to have ended sooner had his advice been accompanied. American commanders who survived him offered different verdicts. They stated 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein's tactical abilities, but questioned his strategic judgment. They praised his careful training, but noted that wars are gained by means of boldness in addition to caution. They conceded his problem for casualties, however, observed that Bernard Law Montgomery's caution from time to time allowed enemies to get away destruction, and they concluded with near unanimity that Montgomery's persona made coalition struggle more difficult than vital. The final evaluation belonged to Eisenhower, writing years after the conflict. He mentioned Bernard Law Montgomery's skills, but stated the Field Marshal's whole lack of ability to recognize the political dimensions of coalition command. First Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, Eisenhower concluded, became a person whose army competencies were undeniable, but whose loss of diplomatic sensitivity made him unsuited for senior command in Allied operations. It became possibly the most devastating critique viable, no longer that Bernard Law Montgomery lacked military competence, but that his virtues had been crushed with the aid of vices that undermined the very motive he served. In coalition war, where character impacts effectiveness as profoundly as strategies or method, Montgomery's disability for treating allies as partners made him no longer simply tough, but risky. The people learned this lesson through bitter enjoy. From North African sand to German mud, they determined that Navy alliances require more than shared enemies. They call for mutual appreciation, acknowledgement of partners' contributions, and willingness to subordinate ego to collective motive. Montgomery, whatever his different characteristics, couldn't meet these requirements, and in that failure lay the solution to why the Americans hated Monty. Not because he turned into British, not due to the fact he became cautious, however because he made them feel like colonial auxiliaries in a conflict they have been winning. Soldiers whose blood mattered, however whose judgment did now not. Allies valued most effective in to this point as they facilitated British glory. That memory outlasted Sir Bernard Law, outlasted the generation that served with him, outlasted even the bloodless battle alliance that grew from wartime cooperation. It served as permanent reminder that technical excellence cannot alternative for human admire, that battlefield brilliance weigh little if it alienates those whose cooperation victory requires. Bernard Law Montgomery changed into many things. Excellent tactician, cautious commander, British hero. However, to the Americans who fought along him, he changed into also a cautionary tale, approximately the limits of army genius divorced from diplomatic knowledge. The question became by no means whether Americans recognized Montgomery's talents. They did. The question changed into whether or not Sir Bernard Law ought to apprehend theirs. He could not. And in that failure of creativeness lay the roots of a bitterness that no amount of shared victory should conquer.